Module 2, adapting your message to your audience, really just deepens what we learned in Module 1 about PABOK. So remembering that PABOK stands for purpose, audience, which is key, information, benefits, objections, and context. What this module 2, really explains is how pretty much all of this is about your audience. So in terms of analyzing your audience, we first want to figure out who they are, and then we'll talk later in this presentation about what information that they need. And then in later chapters, we'll go over the benefits that we can use to help persuade them, analyzing in advance any objections that they may have so that we can present the information in a way to overcome those objections, and then the situation or context that you exist in and are writing your message in, which has a lot to do with organizational culture as well as any kind of recent events that might affect people's reception of your message. And so I talked specifically in one of our other videos in Module 1 about how in school we're often writing writer-based information. We're trying to write to our teacher to demonstrate what we know. So that's really about us. But in business or work communication, we have to transition over to reader-based documents that get the job done, that get her done, that achieve the purpose, that continue to move the work forward. So we talked in Module 1 about how work situations really involve people, some kind of product or service or information that's being exchanged, and the communication that gets that job done. And so really, work communication is all about our audience. And as our Module 2 says at the beginning of the chapter, you need to adapt your message to fit the audience's goals. What are they trying to achieve? Their interests, what's going to grab their attention, and their needs. What information do they need to act on the message that you're sending? There are different types of audiences, so audience can be a little bit more complex. Your primary audience is the decision maker or actor that you're writing directly to, the person who's going to act upon your message or make a decision or answer your request. Often that's a boss. It can sometimes be a coworker or a customer, but your primary audience is the primary target for your message. However, there are also often secondary audiences. There may be other coworkers who have to then implement what's been, asked and answered in the message. People who may make comment on your message, and people who are affected by your message. And so you have to be aware of them. You're always writing to your primary audience, but you have to be aware that other people may react to the way your message was delivered, or may react to whether or not you remember to include certain information that accommodated them as well. So you have to think about those people. The initial audience receives and routes your message. So often, this is a goofy picture of Kevin acting as the receptionist in the office, but your initial audience often receives the message, and this is when things like subject lines become very important, as well as how the message is addressed if it's sent by mail. Because if it doesn't have the correct address on it, or the right office, or the right name or department, or if it doesn't have the right subject line so that the person receiving the message doesn't understand where it should go, or how important it is, right? If it's time sensitive, maybe they don't route it the first day, it doesn't get there for several days, or they don't bring it to the primary audience's attention for a while because they don't know how important it is. That person can kind of waylay your message. And so that's why it becomes really important to use the tools we have available to us, proper addressing, subject lines, those kinds of things. Gatekeepers are people who can stop the message. So sometimes these are the initial audience. That might be like if they don't think it's important enough, then an administrative assistant may try to reduce their boss's workload by sort of, pushing messages to the side, or sorting mail and things like that. And so you don't want the gatekeeper to misunderstand the importance of the message. Sometimes, however, gatekeepers are your boss. Maybe you're trying to promote an idea up to a higher level of management and your immediate supervisor doesn't think it's an important idea. And so you're in a tough situation. Then you have to decide whether or not to go above their head, whether to sit on the message for a while, how important is the message. And so that can be really tricky getting around gatekeepers. But they're people who can stop your message in its tracks and prevent it from moving forward. Watchdogs are external groups that have power or influence over the message or the organization. So for instance, in large corporations, like some of the refineries around here, if any of you are going into process plant like Exxon, Cenex, Conoco, a lot of the moves that they make internally are watched by the press and by the public because they can affect, for instance, the state in terms of taxes that are paid, or the community in terms of their decisions, like when the Corette plant, to mention another plant in town, closed. Clearly there were a lot of people, or signaled that they were going to close. A lot of people who had comments about that, right? So watchdog organizations, or watchdogs, tend to be audiences that sit outside the organization often and are paying attention. They can be internal. They may be people who are sort of secondary, but have some sort of power influence over the actions that happen after the message. So these are the different types of audiences. Realize that all of these people are reading the message, but the message isn't really for all of them. However, because some of them can stop or waylay the message, you have to think about how to present the information so that they know how important it is. And you also have to think about who's going to implement the actions afterward, and have you considered their interests, their objections, benefits to them. As I mentioned, initial audiences, gatekeeper audiences can waylay the message. The book talks about some other communication mishaps, which are things like channel overload. So the book gives the example of if like your organization only has 2 phone lines and all of a sudden you're getting like 30 phone calls all within an hour, some of those messages aren't getting through. Or your email program goes down, the server gets, a virus or something. You can have channel problems, okay? Or like that, when I was talking about routing mail, sometimes if a lot of mail is coming in at once, not all of it gets processed in one day. And so channel overload is when the method or route of the message gets overtaxed and doesn't deliver the message. Information overload is when the person who is getting the message, just the message prioritized poorly because there's too much information at once. So we talked in module 13 about how sometimes people, manage their email by filing email in different folders according to its topic. So if you put like 3 different things all in one email, sometimes the third thing gets forgotten or left out because there's too much information in one message. So sometimes keeping your messages really targeted, specific to one purpose helps, and then sending multiple messages. But you can see how that can also create channel overload. So it's kind of a give and take. The picture I have here is of some kids playing that game Telephone, where you can see how if your channel is not the greatest channel, like one person to another, the message can change throughout time. And so you want to be aware of those kinds of communication mishaps as well. Try to have clear messages and clear channels. So assessing our audience, what do our audiences know? This primarily affects the information that we include and how we present it. The book on page 27 gives us this key term, which is very important. You should learn what this means and because it will show up, but it also is a good concept to help us understand audiences. It's called a discourse community. So if we look up the word discourse in the dictionary, you'll find that what discourse means is communication by thought, words, or by words, talk, conversation, right? So discourse is talking. So a discourse community, as I've shown you here, is a specialized group who shares the vocabulary, knowledge, and communication methods. And the pictures I have here demonstrate that. So for instance, a group of nurses is able to talk in medical terminology and technical terms about a case or a patient in a way that might not be intelligible to outsiders to that group. but they'll know what all of those things mean. Similarly, mechanics can use specialized language when talking to other mechanics, but then when that mechanic steps out into the waiting room and talks to a customer, they're going to have to actually explain key terms and information in a much more elaborate way than they would have to when they're just sort of talking to each other, because their audience has different kinds of knowledge. Okay. And here I've actually put a link to some specialized terms in the mining industry. They, again, each industry, each kind of profession has technical knowledge, and people, insiders to that discourse community, will understand the use of those vocabulary terms without any explanation. But newcomers or customers may actually have to have some definitions or explanations in order to follow the conversation and receive the message. Okay, this website's not loading quickly, so I'm just going to move on. What do audiences expect? This goes to the benefits, objections, and the presentation of information to audiences. A lot of times within your organization, internally, the organizational culture is what you have to be aware of. On page 20 in the yellow section, the book talks about an example where a woman isn't being promoted because actually, even though she does good work, writes good reports, she always turns everything in late, and her boss's priorities are actually punctuality. So maybe if she did less well, but got everything in on time, she would actually meet the values of the organization more directly. And so you want to be aware of how the organization sees itself, how your supervisor sees their team, what are their goals. I used to work for a binder company. They created school binders, and I worked actually in the bindery. I would, put everything together at the end. And we had target goals. We had production goals each day. And so it was kind of like a little race among these cells to see who would get there. But clearly, a high level of production was a big value and a goal in that organization. And you also want to be aware within your company or small business, how is it appropriate to communicate? Do people tend to go face-to-face to get questions answered, or do they tend to document things in texts or emails? Is texting acceptable at your workplace, or is it not a channel that people use? Different corporations actually publish their goals, and so often communicating messages that fall in line, or being able to tie your benefits to the values of an organization, to the vision and how an organization sees itself. This is Wells Fargo's About Us, Our Values page. They talk about ethics and leadership and people as a competitive advantage. So if you're able to tie your benefits to the way the organization sees itself, you're much more likely to be persuasive in your messages. Organizational culture can also, as I just mentioned, affect what channel to use, whether or not you can use that text message, whether or not that's considered, informal. It can also determine how formal to be. Maybe your corporation likes to have people put everything in paper memos, or also it can manage who to include. So for instance, I often have a situation where I have to decide whether or not to, go up to the next supervisory level, or just let my immediate supervisor know about certain things that I'm doing, because sometimes I have to, keep my dean involved with what we're doing at the department level. So you have to think about how your organization works and what's standard practice. And the only way to learn that is just to observe and pay attention. What channels to use? The book reminds us that paper is more formal. And so that paper is good for someone that you don't know well. It's good to send those kinds of things, unless the organizational culture is, to send emails. But when you're addressing, for instance, customers that you haven't met before, often paper is the way to go. Email is good for routine messages to people you already know. It's the common daily routine to send multiple emails at work in the workplace today. And then written is better than oral or talking on the phone or face-to-face for complex information, because that written record allows people to refer back to it. And so if there's a lot of complex data or a lot of complex instructions, you want to send a written message. And then in terms of formality, written communication or scheduled meetings or presentations are more formal than just meeting in the hallway, right? Or talking on the phone. So you have to decide in terms of your message, what's the appropriate method for communicating it. What do audiences need? This has to do with the benefits and objections that we're going to talk about as we begin to compose some more formal written messages, but you want to protect the reader's ego. So even though we talked about with discourse communities how different people have different forms of knowledge, you don't want to make people feel stupid about that. And also, if you're following up about something that you've talked about before, you want to remind them in a way that makes it sound as though you expect them to remember, not that they're, that you expect them to forget. So you might say something like, as you already know, or as per our last conversation, just give them a heads up and protect that sense of self in kind of a gracious way. Headings help different audiences. As we talked about, you can have multiple audiences. Sometimes you have primary and secondary audiences. And so if you have headings, that allows your audience to go right to the area that directly applies to them without having to wade through everything else. You also want to consider demographic information, and demographics are anything that's quantifiable about people. So their age, their race, their education, their income level, okay, things that we can actually, that you might see on a survey about your personal background. And so this can affect the kinds of channels that people are interested in using. Of course, this is a little graphic here about millennials. And so it's thought that millennials are much more, like the younger generation, are much more technology savvy. And so you have to think about that. Is it is a Facebook group page or a Google Sites page going to be appropriate for your organization regarding people's knowledge levels and comfortableness with that media? You also want to consider psychographic information, which has to do with values, beliefs, and goals. And so this is a picture that demonstrates like a type A personality versus a type B personality. Is the person that you're writing to one or the other? Are different kinds of benefits going to make more sense to them? And so you want to think about psychographic. I always just associate with the word psychology. So that reminds me that it's more of like personality or values kinds of questions, whereas demographic, right? Demographic information has to do with those kinds of things that you see on surveys. And so again, module 2 is really going more in depth with this PABOK analysis and showing us that really PABOK is a big way just to analyze our audience in depth. And all of this information, assessing different audiences, different types of audiences, what they know affects what information and how we present it. Their demographics and psychographic information really help us to analyze the benefits and objections that will be effective. And then overall, the context helps us think about, okay, how formal is this? What type of message or channel is appropriate? So all of this audience analysis, you can see, really helps us fill out the rest of the PABOK analysis in a much more complex way.